My name is Celia Harwood, and I was told gently, carefully, with that saccharine tone reserved for old people, that I was too old to join the family vacation this year. That maybe it would be better for me to stay behind, rest, watch the house, water the plants. What they didn't know was, I had already packed my suitcase, and what they forgot was, this house still belonged to me. But let me take you back before the insult wore a smile. It was a Thursday morning in early June. My hands smelled faintly of lavender from folding linens. The Harwoods had a tradition every summer. The whole family flew somewhere coastal. Greece, Portugal, the Amalfi Coast. I'd been there for most of them. Not always in the photos, but always behind the camera holding someone's bag or soothing a sunburn with homemade aloe. I'd packed early this year, not because I was excited, but because I knew Megan would forget to check if I needed anything. My daughter-in-law had a gift for treating me like hotel wallpaper. Always present, never acknowledged. She breezed into the kitchen, heels clicking against the tile, already dressed for errands. "Oh," she said when she saw the suitcase by the door. "You packed?" I smiled. "Yes. I thought I'd ride with you all to the airport on Saturday." There was a pause. The kind that rearranges air molecules. "Celia," she started with a practiced sigh. "I thought Malcolm spoke with you." My son hadn't. He'd probably hoped I'd figure it out on my own. Megan continued, voice syrupy. "It's just that the itinerary this year is a bit intense. Long flights, lots of stairs, and walking everywhere. We were worried it might be too much for you." Too much. I folded my hands calmly. "We thought maybe it'd be more restful if you stayed behind. You know, relax, read, look after things here." "I see," I said. "Because I did. You could enjoy the garden?" "The cat." "I don't have a cat." She tapped the counter awkwardly. "Anyway, we'll bring you something lovely. And you can look after the house like always. Honestly, I wish I had a week of peace like you're about to get." She smiled as if she'd handed me a gift. And in that moment, something quiet inside me snapped. Not with anger, with clarity. I wasn't being invited because they didn't want to include me in the memories. They wanted to preserve the illusion of generosity without the burden of presence. I was a convenience, not a guest. "Oh," I said lightly, "no problem." I pushed the suitcase back into the hallway closet. Megan seemed relieved. "Great. I knew you'd understand." Yes, I understood perfectly. The rest of the day passed with the hollowness of forced acceptance. I pretended to read. I cooked dinner even though no one was hungry. I listened to them discuss flight times and sunscreen as if I were the hired help. That night, I sat alone in my room and stared at the packed suitcase still sitting silently inside the closet. Then I got up and made a call. "Hello," said a familiar voice. "Hi, Everett," I said to our family's longtime attorney. "Do you still have that old file on the Harwood house?" A pause. "The one you and your late husband kept in your name." "Yes," I said. "That one." "I do," he replied carefully. "Want me to dust it off?" "I think it's time," I said. "And Everett." "Yes. Let's make some changes." The day they left for the airport, I made them coffee. Malcolm came down with the kids still rubbing sleep from his eyes. Megan followed behind, already in travel mode. Lipstick, luggage tags, boarding passes, color-coded and clipped to her phone. "Mom," Malcolm said softly, "we really appreciate you staying back this time. It's just, this trip's going to be a bit demanding." I looked at my son, the boy who once held my hand at the beach because he was afraid of waves. The man who now avoided my eyes while handing me the spare key, as if I were a neighbor, not the woman who built the walls around his childhood. I smiled gently. "Of course. You two enjoy it." The children hugged me quickly, distracted by the thought of plane snacks and hotel pools. Megan didn't hug me at all. They loaded their bags, kissed the air near my cheek, and disappeared down the driveway, like any other ordinary morning. When the car turned the corner, I set the key on the table. I wouldn't be needing it. I didn't feel sad. I didn't cry. I simply walked into the guest bedroom and pulled out my real suitcase, the one I had packed. Not with swimsuits and sandals, but with documents, receipts, and the original deed to this house. 2 hours later, I was in Everett's office. He had already reviewed the file. "Well," he said, "you've always owned the property. Your name was never removed. Your husband left you full ownership. The updates Malcolm did after the remodel were cosmetic. No title, transfers, no claim. He never asked. Because he assumed I replied voice even. He nodded. Exactly. And Megan, she has no legal claim whatsoever. Good, I said, sitting taller. I'd like to draft a transition notice. When they return, I want them informed politely legally that they're tenants now. With terms. Everett smiled like a man who had waited too long to see justice served with such precision. Shall we add a clause about behavioral conditions? I tilted my head. No, let them discover that part later. We signed the paperwork. I left the office with a folder that weighed almost nothing and everything. That afternoon, I made myself tea and sat in the garden. The house was silent. The birds were louder than usual, or maybe I was finally hearing them. At 4:17 p. My phone buzzed. A photo from Megan. The entire family on a boat in Santorini. Megan holding a cocktail. Malcolm shirtless, smiling. The kids with windblown hair and ice cream smears. The caption read, "Wish you were here, but not really." I stared at it. Not with anger, with awe. She hadn't even bothered to hide the insult anymore. They had written me out so completely that even guilt seemed unnecessary. I opened the photo, looked at their faces, and then quietly saved it. Not for nostalgia, but for documentation. That night, I moved into the master bedroom. It had once been mine before Malcolm and Megan decided they needed more space after their second child was born. I changed the sheets. I burned a lavender candle. I slept deeply for the first time in months. In the morning, I began sorting through drawers. I found a photo of Richard, our trip to Venice in '89. He had been so patient, so thoughtful. He would have never let anyone exile me from the family like an expired passport. I whispered to his picture, "Don't worry, I'm not punishing them. I'm just reminding them." For the rest of the week, I lived not like a mother-in-law in exile, but like a woman who had finally reclaimed her home. I cooked for myself. I opened the wine I had been saving for a special occasion. This was the occasion. One morning, I walked into Megan's home office and sat at her desk. It was all white lacquer and brass handles filled with receipts and unpaid parking tickets. I placed the transition letter Everett had written on top of her laptop. Right beneath it, I added a sticky note in my own handwriting. "You said I was too old for the trip. Turns out I was too wise to stay small." Then I closed the door softly behind me. A day before they returned, I had the locks changed. I didn't do it out of malice. I did it out of necessity. The paperwork was in place. Everett had filed the legal notice with the county. The Holloway residence was officially and publicly once again Celia Harwood's home. I even updated the mailbox. The brass plate now read simply, C. Harwood. Not the Harwoods, just me. The morning of their arrival, I made myself a full breakfast, something I hadn't done in years. Eggs, toast, blackberries, French press coffee. I was sitting at the kitchen table reading the newspaper when I heard the car pull up. Doors opened. Excited chatter. Suitcases thumped onto the porch. The door handle jiggled. Then, "Celia." Megan's voice called out, laced with confusion. I stood and opened the door calmly. She was sunburnt and disheveled in expensive athleisure. Her designer bag hung from one arm, and behind her stood Malcolm, and the kids, surprised, tired, and still wearing neck pillows. "Something wrong with the lock?" she asked. "No," I replied. "It's been changed." Her eyes narrowed. "Changed." Malcolm stepped forward. "Why, I thought it was time to secure the house, especially since I was here alone." "But we live here," Megan said. I held up an envelope. "This explains everything." She snatched it with a scoff. "Seriously?" Malcolm opened it first. His eyes moved quickly, scanning the formal tone. The property details, the declaration of ownership. "This isn't funny, Mom." "I'm not laughing. You had the locks changed while we were away, after we trusted you to watch my house." I finished calm. Megan crossed her arms. "You're making a mistake." "No," I said. "You made the mistake when you decided I was furniture and forgot I was the foundation." She tried to push past me, but I raised a hand. "You're not locked out," I added. "You're tenants now. You'll receive terms by mail." Malcolm stared at me, a long beat of silence stretching between us. "I don't understand." "No," I said softly, "you don't. But you will." I stepped aside just enough for the children to come in. I hugged them both warmly and told them to wash their hands and get a snack. Megan stood frozen. I left you something too, I said. On the table. She stormed into the kitchen. On the table sat a small, elegant white box wrapped with navy ribbon. Inside it, 4 coasters from the Santorini boat cruise. The ones I saw in her Instagram photos. I had ordered identical ones online. On top of them, I had placed the printed caption from her post. Wish you were here. But not really. Her face flushed red. I watched her closely. I meant that as a joke, she said weakly. No, I replied. You meant it exactly how it sounded. And that's why you'll never stand where I used to in this house. Ever again. Malcolm finally found his voice. You've been planning this. I've been surviving this, I answered. I turned away before he could speak again. I had no more energy for people who mistook my kindness for permission. Later that evening, Megan packed a bag and left for her sister's house. Malcolm and the children stayed. We didn't speak much, but when I served dinner, he came to the table without a word and ate every bite. I didn't gloat. I didn't preach. I simply reclaimed what was already mine. That night, I sat alone on the back porch. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still. And in the stillness, I whispered a single sentence I hadn't let myself believe for years. They took me for granted because I never made them earn it. Now they would. The next morning, the house was quiet in a new way. Not with the heavy silence of exclusion, but with clarity. Malcolm made breakfast for the kids. Toast, peanut butter, juice boxes. He didn't ask where anything was. He didn't speak to me either. He was moving through the motions like a man reading from a script he barely remembered. I let him feel the weight of things that had always been invisible before, what it took to run this house, to hold it together, to show up without applause. By noon, the children were playing in the backyard, and Malcolm approached me in the living room. Mom, he said, not accusatory, not defensive, just worn. I didn't know the house was still in your name. I know. I thought after Dad passed. You stopped thinking after Dad passed, I said gently. You let her decide how I fit. He sat down, rubbing his temples. I didn't mean to exclude you. That's the point, Malcolm, I replied. You didn't mean to do anything. You let it happen. He looked up, eyes tired. What do we do now? I didn't answer with comfort. I answered with truth. You can stay. The kids can stay. But Megan, she made herself very clear. He didn't argue. He simply nodded. There was a flicker of the old boy in his face, the one who used to cry when he scraped his knees, who once drew me a picture of our house and labeled it Mom's Castle. He left shortly after to pick up the children's things from his sister-in-law's place. Megan had already packed boxes for him. That said enough. The next day, an email arrived. From Megan. The subject line read, Legal clarification. I didn't open it. Instead, I forwarded it to Everett. He replied within the hour. Handled. She has no recourse. And that was that. She, who had said I was too old for a family trip, had now been written out of the only legacy that mattered. That weekend, I made cookies with the children. We shaped the dough into seashells and tiny boats, just like I used to do when Malcolm was their age. The kitchen filled with warmth, the smell of vanilla, and something else I hadn't felt in a long time. Belonging. They didn't ask why I hadn't gone on the trip. They just wanted me to tell them stories while the oven hummed. So I did. Stories of places I'd been, of oceans I'd swum in, of gardens that had healed me. I didn't need to mention Megan's name. Children don't need the details of betrayal, only the assurance that the people who love them don't disappear. Later that evening, I took out the old photo album. Page after page of family vacations. Smiles. Sand. Sunglasses. There I was, behind the scenes, in every one holding a towel, adjusting a hat, fixing a shoe. Always present, never centered. Until the last few pages blank. I picked up a pen and wrote across the final page in steady cursive. This is where I stopped asking to be included. This is where I started choosing myself. Then I closed the album and tucked it into the bookshelf, not as a record of what was, but as proof of what I wouldn't allow again. Not from Megan, not from Malcolm, not from anyone. I went to bed early that night. No suitcase by the door. No waiting. No hoping for an invitation. Just stillness. And strength. Because when they said I was too old to go with them, What they really meant was, "You've outgrown your place in this story." And they were right. I had. So I wrote a new one. I started clearing the guest room the next morning. The one Megan always claimed for her work calls. She had painted it white, filled it with sleek furniture, made sure there wasn't a single trace of comfort left. A room designed to exclude the past. I opened the closet. Inside were boxes, old electronics, empty gift bags, receipts and folders, with her name scribbled across them in pink ink. I placed them all in a tote bag and labeled it, "For pickup." No note, no confrontation, just closure. Then I opened the windows and let the breeze fill the room. It smelled like air that had waited too long to move. Malcolm came home that afternoon with the children and a single suitcase. I noticed he didn't bring any of Megan's things back. "She's staying at her sister's for now," he said. I nodded. "That's best." He hesitated at the bottom of the stairs. "I told her not to contact you again." "She already tried." I forwarded it to Everett. He looked down ashamed. "I'm sorry." "You don't have to keep saying that," I replied. "But you do have to start showing me something else." He glanced at the kids, then back to me. "Like what?" "Presence," I said. "Not just being here, but being aware of how you let someone silence me under my own roof." His voice cracked. "I thought I was protecting peace." I folded a towel. "Sometimes peace is just another name for cowardice." He didn't argue, didn't defend her, didn't defend himself. And that was the first honest thing he'd done in years. Over the next few days, the house became something different. Not restored, not repaired, rewritten. I changed the living room curtains, put my grandmother's quilt back on the couch, replaced the glass dining table Megan had insisted on with the old oak one Richard had built with his hands. The children noticed first. "Grandma," my granddaughter said, "why does everything feel cozier?" "Because it belongs to someone who wants you to feel safe," I answered. That night, she fell asleep curled in my lap as I read her The Secret Garden. Malcolm sat nearby, wordless, listening to a story he'd heard 100 times as a boy, but had never really understood until now. A few days later, a letter arrived. Not from Megan, from her lawyer. Politely worded, formally distant, requesting consideration for past contributions to the household and suggesting an amicable discussion about the future. I didn't reply. I let Everett handle it. He emailed me later. I responded, "She has no claim. She signed off on every financial document you presented. She assumed ownership that was never hers." I stared at that last sentence. She assumed ownership that was never hers. And isn't that what this entire saga had been about? Assumptions. That I'd stay quiet. That I'd stay grateful. That I'd stay small. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply began planning something I hadn't done in years. A trip, not with family, not for obligation, for me. I booked a small cottage on the Scottish coast. Just me, a field sketchbook, and the sound of waves on stone. When I told Malcolm, he blinked in surprise. "Scotland?" he asked. I nodded. "Your father and I always said we'd go. He passed before we could." He leaned against the doorway thinking, "Do you need help getting ready?" I smiled gently. "No, but thank you for asking." And for once, I could tell he meant it. That night, I stood by the window in my bedroom, the one Megan once said had bad natural light. The moon poured through it like silver truth. And I whispered something not to her, not to Malcolm, but to the woman I used to be. "You waited too long to be seen, but you don't have to wait to be free." The day I left for Scotland, the morning air was so still I could hear the birds breathing between their songs. Malcolm drove me to the airport. He loaded my bag gently into the trunk like it wasn't just luggage, but a symbol. Something fragile and earned. We didn't speak much on the drive. He played a quiet jazz station. I looked out the window watching the town blur past, wondering how many women had driven down this road having never taken a trip alone. When we pulled into the drop-off lane, he helped me out of the car, then stood there unsure. "I don't know how to say this," he said, eyes lowered. "Then don't," I replied. "Just remember it." He nodded, then asked something unexpected. "Will you send postcards?" I smiled. "Only if you promise to read them out loud to the kids." He blinked fast, holding back tears, then stepped back as I walked into the terminal. And just like that, I was on my way alone, free and completely unburdened. The cottage was perfect. It sat on a cliff edge surrounded by wildflowers and mist that rolled in like the sea was trying to speak softly. The air was salted and cold, but it woke me up in the best way, like the truth does when you finally say it out loud. I spent the mornings walking the coast, the afternoons sketching plants and birds and windswept grass. I filled page after page with observations the same way I once filled every day in my old life, with silent endurance. One afternoon, while drawing a gull perched on a rusted fence post, I thought about Megan. Not with hate, with gratitude. Because sometimes the greatest gift is not an apology. It's a line drawn so clearly that you finally step over it and don't look back. I mailed 3 postcards. One to the grandchildren with a pressed wildflower inside and a note. I miss your laughter. The sea does too. One to Judith, my oldest friend, who once told me in a hushed voice, "One day you'll stop shrinking to make room for her." And one to myself. Yes, myself. I addressed it to Celia Harwood, former background character, current protagonist. I wrote, "Look at you, sitting on the edge of the world, like you own the view." And you do. When I returned home 2 weeks later, the house greeted me like a friend who had saved a seat. Warm, still, whole. There were drawings from the grandchildren taped to the refrigerator. A stack of handwritten notes from Malcolm. One even said, "Thanks for teaching me how to stay behind with grace, and how to leave with power." No one had ever thanked me for leaving before. But that's the thing. We praise women for staying, for enduring, for smiling through it. But sometimes, leaving is the bravest act of all. That Sunday we had dinner together. Just me, Malcolm, and the kids. No one asked about Megan. No one missed her raised eyebrows or tight smiles. We laughed. We remembered. And when my granddaughter asked, "Grandma, did you miss us?" I said, "Yes, but I remembered myself while I was gone. And I'm going to keep remembering." She blinked, confused. But one day she'll understand. She'll find herself in a room where someone says she's too old, too much, too inconvenient. And maybe she'll remember her grandmother. The one who was told to stay home, and chose instead to leave. It was a quiet Tuesday when Megan returned. I wasn't expecting it. Not really. But I wasn't surprised either. People like Megan don't disappear. They retreat, recalibrate, and return when they think the temperature has cooled. She showed up in a gray sedan I didn't recognize, wearing oversized sunglasses and an even larger sense of entitlement. I was trimming the rose bushes when I heard the tires on gravel. She stepped out of the car and stood at the edge of the driveway like a politician greeting a crowd that never showed. "Celia," she said, her voice too bright. I didn't answer. I just kept pruning. She took a few hesitant steps forward. "I came to see the children." I set the shears down. "They're at school," I replied. "And if you're here to reclaim something you think you lost, I should let you know it was never yours." She bristled. "You think you've won something?" I straightened, wiped my gloves, and looked her in the eye for the first time since that dinner table humiliation. "I didn't win. I simply stopped giving you the power to make me lose." She scoffed, trying to maintain composure. "I could have stayed and made your life miserable." "You already did," I said quietly. "Now I'm simply undoing the damage." For a moment I thought she'd yell, but instead she looked around the trimmed hedges, the restored furniture on the porch. The wind chimes Richard had hung decades ago now ringing soft and clear. "I never understood what Malcolm saw in this house," she murmured. "That's because you were always looking at it as a structure," I replied, "not a sanctuary." She exhaled slowly, like someone realizing too late they'd misread the entire map. "I suppose I should leave?" I nodded. "And Megan," she paused. "You were wrong. I'm not too old for anything. But you're too proud to see what you lost." She didn't argue. She just got in her car and drove away. Not like a woman leaving a battle, but like someone who realized the war was already over and she was on the wrong side of it. Malcolm didn't ask for details when I told him she'd come by. He only asked if I was okay. And I told him the truth. I've never felt more okay in my life. That weekend I sat on the back porch with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the garden sway under the sunset. The wind was gentle, almost reverent. The kind of evening that makes you believe time is folding in your favor. I opened my sketchbook and began to draw again. Not the plants, not the birds, but myself. Not as I was, but as I am now, wiser, stronger, visible. And then I added one last note to the bottom corner of the page. She said I was too old for family vacations. Now she's not invited into my piece. 2 months passed. The leaves began their quiet, golden descent, and with them came an invitation hand-delivered by Malcolm on a crisp Sunday morning. It was an envelope. Heavy, cream-colored, embossed with gold foil. Inside, a wedding invitation. His cousin Rebecca's daughter getting married in the countryside. Family-only ceremony. Warm, small, dignified. I held the card delicately as if it might change its wording if I stared too long. Then I saw it. Malcolm Harwood and guest. I looked up at him, raising an eyebrow. I told her I wouldn't come unless you were invited, he said, setting a jar of plum jam on the kitchen counter like it was part of the same sentence. And she agreed. He nodded. It's time. I turned the card over in my hand and felt something shift, an invisible thread tightening and loosening all at once. There was a time when being a guest would have stung, when the label would have reminded me I was tolerated, not treasured. But now it meant something else. It meant I had the power to say yes or no, and that choice was mine alone. The wedding weekend arrived. The countryside estate was nothing short of a painting stone manor, sprawling gardens, strings of lanterns fluttering like captured stars. Everyone was dressed in pastel or navy, polished shoes on gravel paths, laughter beneath pergolas. As I stepped out of the car in a deep emerald dress and matching shawl, heads turned. Not out of scandal, out of silence. That curious silence that ripples through a crowd when they see a woman they thought they'd written off. Alive, poised, unbothered. Rebecca greeted me with cautious warmth. Celia, it's been too long. I smiled. Time does that. It gives distance to the wrong people and perspective to the right ones. She blinked, unsure if it was a compliment, and I left it at that. The ceremony was beautiful, but it was the reception where things unfolded. We were seated under a linen canopy near the orchard. Fairy lights glimmered between the branches like memories resurfacing. And then, across the garden, I saw her, Megan, standing beside a second cousin sipping sparkling water, wearing beige so thoroughly that she practically faded into the hedges. She wasn't family anymore, but technically she was a +1 of someone vaguely connected. She hadn't seen me yet. Malcolm noticed the shift in my gaze and said, "We can leave." But I shook my head. "Why? I've earned this table." She's borrowing a chair. When our eyes finally met, she froze. And for a second, just 1 second, I saw it: envy. Not the shallow kind that cares about dresses or jewelry. The deeper kind. The envy of someone who realizes the woman she tried to shrink had grown too big to ignore. She approached during the cake cutting. Her voice was almost a whisper. "You look good." "Alive," I replied, slicing a small square of vanilla cake. She nodded slowly. "I heard you've been traveling, teaching art classes, volunteering, even got a feature in that magazine." I simply said yes. She looked down at her empty plate. "People say you've changed." "No," I said, "I just stopped hiding." She didn't have a response, so I gave her one. "Don't worry, Megan. You're not the villain of this story. Just a background character who mistook herself for the lead." She stiffened lips, trembling. But I didn't stay to watch her unravel. I walked back to my table, where laughter was rising like music, where hands reached for mine, where no one questioned my place. And I knew the real vacation had never been the one they excluded me from. It was the life I reclaimed when I chose myself. By winter, my world had changed so completely it startled even me. The art studio downtown, once just a whisper of a dream, was now fully mine. I leased the sunlit space above an old bookstore, where the walls smelled faintly of paper and possibility. I named it Second Bloom. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I held classes for women over 50, most of them widowed, retired, or simply invisible in their own homes. We painted, we laughed, and sometimes we cried. But mostly we remembered how it felt to be seen again. They called me Miss Celia, even though I never asked them to. Something about that title made me feel more rooted than I had in years. and in the soft, chalky hum of brushes on canvas, I felt myself come alive again. One snowy morning, as I unlocked the door, I found an envelope slipped beneath it. There was no return address. Inside, a single note handwritten in familiar cursive. I know I failed you. I don't deserve forgiveness. But if you ever want to talk, I'll be at the old tea house by the bridge Fridays at 3. I won't come again unless you do. Megan. I stared at it for a long time, not out of anger, out of disbelief. Could she really be asking for what? Redemption, forgiveness, a second chance. That Friday I didn't go. The following Friday I didn't either. But the third one, I stood at the window of the studio watching snow flurries dance like feathers. And I wondered, what would it cost me to listen? I arrived at the tea house precisely at 3:10, hoping she'd already left. But she was there, alone. She looked different, smaller, not in body but in presence. Her once coiled ambition now unwound and fraying. She stood when she saw me. You came. I sat without speaking. She ordered chamomile for me, remembered my favorite. And then she said quietly, "You didn't deserve any of it." I let the silence stretch, watching her squirm. "I was threatened by you," she admitted. "By the way Malcolm loved you, by your calm, your stillness. I mistook it for weakness." I sipped my tea. "It wasn't weakness," I said. "I know that now," she replied. "And I'm sorry. Not because of what I lost, but because of what I did to you." That landed, because for the first time she wasn't trying to get anything. She was just trying to own what she did. After a long pause, I said, "Megan, forgiveness is not an inheritance. It's not owed just because you ask." She nodded. "I understand." But I continued, "Growth is rare, and I respect rare things." She looked up surprised. "I don't know if I'll ever invite you back in," I said. "But I'm willing to keep showing up. Not for you, for me. To see who I am in your presence." And that oddly was enough. She smiled faintly. "I'll be here next Friday." "I might come," I said. And we parted not as enemies or friends, but as two women aware of the past and unwilling to let it write the final line. Later that night, I returned to Second Bloom, turned on the jazz radio, and painted long into the dark. One brushstroke after another, layering forgiveness not as absolution, but as reclamation. Not for her. For me. Spring arrived like a slow exhale, softening the world with tulips and warm rains. I hadn't returned to the tea house since that conversation with Megan, but I hadn't thrown away her note either. It remained tucked inside my daily planner between a grocery list and a clipping of Monet's Woman with a Parasol. Some wounds don't scab. They don't need to. They simply stop asking for attention. One April afternoon, Malcolm showed up at the studio with a bouquet of lilacs in one hand and a sheepish look on his face. I met someone, he said, the way children confess to mischief, excited and scared. "Someone living," I teased. He laughed. "Very real. Clever, brilliant, and she reminds me of you." I paused. "Do you like her?" I asked. He nodded with a quiet, certain smile. "Then you don't need my blessing. You already have my trust." He exhaled deeply. "You have no idea what that means to me." "Oh, Malcolm," I said gently. "I think I do." That night, I walked home instead of driving. The air carried that perfect tension between chill and bloom, like a secret waiting to be spoken. I passed a cafe, the one I used to avoid when Megan worked remote from there. And for the first time, I didn't look away. It wasn't until I reached my doorstep that I noticed something tucked inside the mailbox. A legal envelope. I recognized the lawyer's name, our old family estate attorney. My hands tensed slightly. Inside, a copy of a trust update. It was Malcolm's. He'd added my name. A 15% stake in a property investment we both knew was worth a small fortune. No note. Just the action. A gesture that said, "You're still my center," no matter what anyone else said. I closed the door behind me and stood in the kitchen staring at that paper. Not because of the money, but because for once someone had chosen me without asking for anything back. And that was new. The next weekend, I attended a local community exhibit featuring women of the third act. My students had their art on display. Bright sunflowers, fractured self-portraits, vivid memoryscapes of lost homes and reborn dreams. At the center of the room stood a canvas titled, "Still Rooted, My Peace." A woman painted from behind seated under a blossoming tree. The leaves overhead resembled paper cranes, as if they might take flight at any moment. A young woman, maybe in her 20s, stood staring at it for a long time. Then she turned to me. "This feels like something my grandmother might have painted if she hadn't been so busy surviving." I blinked. "I'm glad you saw it," I whispered. That evening, I journaled. "This life I have now, it's not the one I asked for, but it's the one I shaped. Not from revenge, not from bitterness, but from the audacity to matter." And then I drew a little star beside that last line. A reminder that even when they try to erase you, you can redraw the map and sign your name in ink. 2 months later, I got a call from an unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something told me to answer. "Hello, Mrs. Caro," the voice asked. "Yes. Who's speaking?" "This is Rachel Bloom from Silverwood Assisted Living." My stomach dropped. "Is everything okay? I'm calling because Megan Caro listed you as her emergency contact." I paused. "Megan, emergency contact." "She collapsed at work this morning, dehydration and stress," they said. "She's recovering now. Alert, but she insisted we call you." I thanked the woman and hung up, but stood frozen in my hallway for a long time. The irony wasn't lost on me. Megan, who once said I belonged in a nursing home, had checked herself into the very world she once threatened me with. Still, by evening, I was at Silverwood with a small vase of garden roses from my front yard. The receptionist led me to her room. She was sitting upright in bed, hair undone, eyes tired. "You came," she said softly. I placed the flowers on the nightstand. "You listed me as your emergency contact." She looked away. "I don't really have anyone else." That stung more than I expected. "I've been tired," she said, "since everything happened. The divorce, losing my job last fall. I moved in with a friend, then out. I kept telling myself I'd bounce back. But..." She looked up. "Celia, do you think people deserve what they get?" I sat slowly. "No," I said. "But I think sometimes people get what they need to grow." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't want you to pity me," she said. "I don't," I replied. "But I see you." She looked away again. "It's strange. I thought being strong meant never falling. But now, lying here, I feel more real than I ever have." I helped her sign the discharge paperwork the next day. She moved into a small apartment nearby. Nothing grand, just enough. I didn't offer her money, but I offered her something harder. Space. Space to be someone different than who she was. And in time, she began to show up, not perfectly, but consistently. She helped organize a fundraiser at Second Bloom. She brought cookies to the classes, store-bought, but always thoughtfully chosen. She apologized to the women she once judged harshly at family dinners. And once during cleanup, she said to me, "I thought being part of the family meant control, but you showed me it means contribution." That was the closest she ever came to saying thank you. And it was enough. A year later, we stood together in the back row of Malcolm's wedding. He married his bright, beautiful Clara in a field of wildflowers. As they exchanged vows, I felt Megan lightly squeeze my hand. "I'm glad you're here," she whispered. I didn't reply. I just held on. Not to her. To the version of myself I fought hard to reclaim. The woman who traveled alone, repotted her roots, and found peace not by erasing others, but by refusing to be erased. The day after the wedding, I sat by the window of my sunlit living room, sipping Earl Grey and watching the breeze play with the sheer curtains. A soft smile lingered on my face, not from joy, but from something sturdier. Peace. Then the doorbell rang. It was a courier. He handed me a padded envelope with a return label I recognized instantly. It was from Malcolm. Inside was a letter handwritten in his slightly crooked scrawl. "Mom, you once told me that silence isn't absence, it's patience. I didn't understand then, but I do now. You waited through so much. Not passively, not angrily, but with purpose. This house we're living in now, Clara and I, it's yours. I used the family trust to put the deed in your name. You don't have to do anything. Just know, this is my way of saying you were always the foundation. We built everything on the space you gave us. And now I want to give some of that back. Love you, Malcolm." I reread it twice. then folded it neatly and slid it into the drawer beside my favorite teacup, the one Megan once called outdated. Later that week, I returned to Second Bloom. There was a new face in the Wednesday class. A woman named Adira, perhaps in her late 60s, with tired eyes and hesitant hands. "I used to paint," she said quietly, "before my daughter told me I wasn't needed anymore." I sat next to her. "You still are," I said. "Needed. And seen." She smiled shyly. Then she picked up a brush and dipped it into a stormy blue. And just like that, another woman started to reclaim herself. That evening, I walked through my neighborhood, the spring light slanting gold through the trees. Children played in the yards. A couple jogged by holding hands. Life unfolded in its usual rhythms, but something had shifted in me. Not a dramatic transformation, just a return. A return to wholeness, to knowing I didn't need to be loud to be powerful or bitter to be strong. They had tried to make me invisible. Instead, I became inevitable. When I got home, I opened my old journal, the one I had almost thrown away during the worst months. On the last page, I wrote, "There was a time I begged for their approval. Now I bless myself. There was a time I chased inclusion. Now I define belonging. There was a time I asked for love. Now I walk in it." I placed the journal back on the shelf beside the family photo album, not out of sentiment, but as a symbol, a reminder that I can hold both grief and gratitude, distance and dignity, that I am not what they said I was, and never will be. A few weeks later, Megan asked if I'd like to join her for coffee. It wasn't Mother's Day or my birthday, just an ordinary Thursday morning. We sat at a small table near the window of a quiet cafe. She ordered chamomile tea. I had my usual black, no sugar. She fidgeted with the corner of her napkin. "I've been meaning to tell you something," she said. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing. "I'm sorry," she continued, "for everything. For thinking I knew better. For thinking your age made you less." There was a weight to her voice I hadn't heard before. I didn't understand what it meant to be a woman who gives everything and is then told she's taken up too much space. That made me pause. "You didn't understand because you didn't have to," I replied softly. "Until the day you did." She nodded slowly. "I see that now." Outside the window, two young women were laughing over croissants. One of them tossed her head back unbothered, radiant. "I used to be her," Megan whispered. "And I thought I'd always stay her." We were both quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Maybe you'll be something better." That evening, Malcolm stopped by with Clara. They brought over leftover lemon cake from the wedding and news. Clara was expecting. "You're going to be a grandmother again," he said with a grin. I felt my throat catch. It wasn't just the baby. It was the way Malcolm's eyes softened, the way Clara reached for my hand. There was no resentment in their gestures, no distance, just belonging. Later, after they left, I found myself wandering through the rooms of my home, imagining the new life that would soon join us. The same home that once echoed with judgment now pulsed with possibility. I thought back to the night I packed my suitcase back when I was told I didn't belong on the family trip. It seemed like a lifetime ago, and in some ways it was. That version of me, the one who needed their permission, had been left behind with that suitcase. Now I held the passport to something far more powerful: self-defined worth. Megan, to her credit, didn't try to force closeness after her apology. She simply showed up in small ways. She offered to drive me to the market when it rained. She baked cinnamon scones and left them at my door. She sent me texts that read, "Thinking of you," without needing a reply. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't performative. It was healing. In its own slow, silent way. And that made all the difference. By late spring, the roses in my garden bloomed wider than they had in years. Neighbors complimented them, and I smiled, knowing they had no idea that these blossoms grew from more than soil. They grew from everything I had buried and everything I had let go. From rejection, from judgment, from the belief that I had to prove anything to anyone. I didn't, because I had already bloomed, and not even time could undo that. Summer arrived slowly with golden evenings and jasmine-scented breezes. My days took on a new rhythm, gentle, deliberate, and full. I resumed teaching watercolor at the community center once a week. My students were mostly women like me, quiet, overlooked, but quietly brimming with stories no one had asked them to tell. And we painted, Not flowers or still life. We painted memories. One afternoon, I watched as Adira, the woman who had joined our class in the spring, worked on a canvas of a woman standing alone at a station, suitcase in hand. Her brush trembled, but her eyes were steady. "You gave her back." Her voice, she said without looking up. I didn't ask who her was. We both knew. At home, I began to write again. Just little pieces. Letters I never sent. Thoughts I never voiced. I kept them in a leather-bound journal I found tucked away in my closet, ironically a gift from Megan many Christmases ago. I flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "To the woman who was told she was too old, too fragile, too much. You are the fire they pretend not to see. You are the roots beneath the home they forgot you built. You are the silence that shouts louder than their noise. You are not gone. You are just beginning." One morning, Megan invited me to lunch with just her and Clara. "A girls' afternoon," she said. I hesitated. Not because I was angry. I wasn't, but because I no longer felt the need to say yes to everything, just to keep the peace. Still, something in her voice told me this was different. I agreed. They took me to a quiet restaurant with linen napkins and lavender lemonade. We laughed more than I expected. They asked about my students, about painting, about the book club I had started at the senior center. At one point, Clara reached across the table and said, "You know, the baby's middle name will be Celia." I froze. Megan smiled softly. It was Malcolm's idea, but we both loved it. My throat tightened. Not because I needed their validation, but because it no longer hurt to receive it. That night, I stood by my bedroom window watching fireflies blink in the darkness. A cool breeze drifted in, brushing my face like a whisper. In the stillness, I realized the revenge I had taken wasn't in grand gestures or harsh words. It was in choosing myself, in taking back my dignity without noise, without apology. They had underestimated me, and I had rewritten the ending, not with rage, but with grace. A year later, I found myself standing at the edge of a sandy shore with my granddaughter in my arms. They had invited me on the next family vacation. This time they didn't ask if I was too old. They asked what kind of room I wanted. They didn't pack behind my back. They planned with me, and when I walked through the gates of that seaside resort, I didn't feel like a guest. I felt like a matriarch. Megan approached as the sun began to dip. The sky had softened to lavender and gold. The wind tangled her hair as she handed me a small-shelled, delicate spiral pink as rose quartz. "It reminded me of you," she said. I turned the shell over in my palm. "Because I'm hard on the outside and hollow inside." She laughed. "No, because it's a survivor, and inside it holds the ocean." For the first time in a long while, I let her see me cry. Not because I was hurt, because I had healed. That night, as we sat around the bonfire, Clara played soft music while Malcolm grilled corn. Children darted between deck chairs, sticky with melted marshmallows. Someone handed me a warm mug of cocoa. And for once, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to go wrong. I simply belonged. The truth is, I never needed revenge. What I needed was clarity. What I needed was choice. What I needed was to walk away from anyone who couldn't see my worth, and then walk back only if I wanted to. Not because they begged, but because I had forgiven. And that is what true power looks like. Not slamming a door, but choosing which one to leave open. And standing in that open doorframe, smiling not to be invited in, but to welcome others into the strength you built alone. They said I was too old. They said I didn't belong. They said the trip was no place for a woman like me. But what they didn't know was this. You can't exile the roots of a tree and expect it to stop growing. You can't silence a woman who's been quiet by choice, not by weakness. In the end, I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't fight my way into their itinerary. I simply let the silence do its work. While they flew to paradise, I rewrote the will. I rewrote the boundaries. And most importantly, I rewrote myself. Because sometimes power isn't in the revenge. It's in the patience. In the elegance of saying, "You don't see my worth. That's fine. But you won't see my generosity either." This story wasn't just about exclusion. It was about awakening. It was about finding the woman underneath decades of self-sacrifice and letting her speak at last with more than words. So if you've ever been told you're too much, too old, or simply not invited, let them go. and become someone they'll have to earn their way back to. And if they don't, then let the silence speak for you. Because in the world of Grace's truth, we don't scream, we don't chase, we build, and sometimes quietly, beautifully, we walk away until the world comes knocking. Subscribe to Grace's Truth to hear more stories whispered behind closed doors where dignity wins and silence is the loudest revenge of all.